Well, Iran in the time I was born, and it was very much traditionalist, and I was kind of in a very interesting family because my father's family was very conservative, Islamic, devout Islamic. My mother's family, on the other hand, they were much more westernized. Most of the members would go to France and study, and like in our house, the second language was French after the Farsi, with the Iranian language. And I was the only child. My mother married when she was very, very young. She was 15 when I was born. And later on, believe it or not, then because of her father, it's a very interesting historical part because the British played a major role in the Middle East at that time, and they wanted very much, of course, to control the oil and all of that stuff, which is still going on to this day. They created Iraq first because there was no country in Iraq. They were all tribes. And believe it or not, it was a British lady who named the place Iraq. Her name was Gertrude Bell. And they put even a king there and all that. And they also then worked very hard in Iran, and they got rid of the old dynasty, which was the Qajars, and they had been ruling the country for about 200 years, and they put in a gentleman from the cavalry as the Shah, Reza Shah, and he added Pahlavi to it and all that stuff. So there's a little background then, because then my maternal grandfather was connected to the last dynasty. And so he had to go into hiding, of course, and he was then protected by the Christian missionaries. And he was so grateful to them that actually when he came finally, when he could come out and he was safe and all that, he converted to Christianity. And that then influenced my mother when I was about 5 years old, and my mother converted to Christianity. So it was a very interesting family. There was my father, who was very, very conservative Islamic, and there was my mother, who was became a Christian. So, and I was the only child between this kind of thing. So in a way, I felt I was lucky because I studied the Quran in school, and I went to church on Sundays and studied the Bible. And I love the Christian services because there was music in it. Because the Islamic services, as you know, they're very, very serious and incredibly, you have to pray 5 times a day and all that stuff. I just love that kind of more of the European and the Christianity of it, the singing and the hymns and all that. It just was wonderful. So that was a little bit of my background that I kind of was brought up into this, shall we say, mixed bag situation as the only child. So that, but the music in our home and in Iran at that time, of course, men were not supposed to have anything to do with the arts, especially with music and all that. The ladies could, like my mother played 3 different instruments. She played the tar and she played the violin and all that. But when I was very young and I loved the music so much, I asked my father that I love piano very, very much. And so his attitude was, "You love the piano?" I said, "Oh yes, I love it." He said, "Very good. I'll get somebody to play it for you." So it was a matter, you paid. And if you wanted to insult somebody in those days in Iran, you would call them a dancer or a musician and all that. They were all of the lower echelon in the society. So it was not in any sense that you let your children study. The ladies did it because they would have salons. My mother, Friday is it's like Sunday. It's a day of rest in Iran, in the Islamic countries. And my mother always had a salon. And then she would play her tar, she would play the violin. And her side of the family, one uncle was a very well-known poet and a writer who actually ended up by giving a lot of lectures because then the Shah tried very, very much to modernize Iran. And he used Ataturk, who had modernized Turkey, and he used it as a little bit like a model. And so my uncle would go around and give lectures, and at that time, the Shah was even trying to, in order to modernize the society, they would not allow the ladies to wear chadors, the dark robe. That they would tear it away, which is the exact opposite today, because now they have the dress codes and the police that if you don't have the handkerchief just the right way, you're going to get fined and go to the police. So it was a very, very kind of a exciting period at that time. And the Shah was trying to modernize it in a way. But I did not like the Eastern music. Like my mother would listen. There was an Egyptian, very famous Egyptian lady singer named Kulthum. When she died, over 1 million people attended her funeral. I always thought she sounded pained. I thought maybe she was constipated. I mean, it was just very, I didn't like it. Then when the Second World War started, then the Allies came in and they replaced the Shah because the Shah had started playing footsies with the Nazis. So they got rid of him and they put his son, who at that time was only 18, on the throne. But what was interesting then, Tehran, which is the capital of Iran, was then surrounded with 4 camps. There was the American camps, there was the Russian camp, the French camp, and the British camp. And I then discovered the Armed Air Force radio. And so I was not allowed to listen to it. And so I would sneak down to the living room when everybody was sound asleep and would put something over my head and I would listen to the Armed Forces radio. I would listen to Glenn Miller and Artie Shaw and all that kind of stuff. So that was another bit of an introduction for me. Then my mother loved films very much. And so she would go to films and she would take me to films. And then, of course, I discovered the Western music really through the Hollywood films. Because I always say, this is an absolute true story. The first time I ever heard Beldi, the aria from Butterfly, was my beloved Diana Durbin. She sang it in the film called First Love, the film where she got kissed for the first time, of course. It was heaven for Diana to get kissed. And then she sang Beldi, but I always thought Beldi was in English because she sang it in English. Later on, the first time I heard Nessun Dorma, the aria from Turandot, of the tenor's aria, was my beloved Diana, sang it as a soprano in a film called His Butler's Sister. So my introduction to the Western music, especially the symphonic music and the vocal music and all that, was through the Hollywood films. And I loved it. I loved it. And I would then, if I saw a film of Diana Durbin and I was a kid, my voice hadn't changed yet, I would go in our garden and I would attempt singing. And then I must have made awful noises because then the servant of our neighbor would come in and says, would you please tell Lotfi, stop singing, the lady's taking her nap. And so I would stop. And when the lady would awaken, the servant would come in and say, Lotfi can go on singing now. The lady's up. So that was a little bit of mine. I kind of listened to Jeanette MacDonald, and the first time I heard the aria of Wolfram from Tannhäuser was sung, not by baritone, was sung by Risa Stevens in the film with Nelson Eddy called The Chocolate Soldier. So that really was my introduction to Western music, and I loved it. I just was addicted to it. And then, of course, we were in the 40s, if you remember. Hollywood had fantastic composers because all of them had run away from the Nazis. Erich Korngold, Max Steiner, Franz Waxman. So you listen to these soundtracks and you would hear Strauss, and you would hear, Schoenberg, and you would hear all the development of the music from Europe through these incredible composers. So that really was my kind of introduction to the Western music of that. That's how I fell in love with it. There was the custom in the families, in our family, that once you finished high school in Tehran, then the parents would decide what's the they wanted you to do, and they would send them either to Europe or United States. A lot of my cousins went to Europe and United States, and my father, just a year before I finished the high school, then he decided that I was going to university. But he, of course, from the day I was born, he had decided I was going to become a doctor. Because in the family, either you were a lawyer or an architect or a doctor. I mean, you know, there was no questions. So he had registered me in the University of Edinburgh in Scotland because he didn't believe in American education. And he felt the American education was, you know, too light and fluffy and all that stuff. He believed that was much more serious. But of course, yours truly did not want to go to Scotland because one of my dearest friends, also two of my friends that we grew up with, because I attended then as a teenager, a lot of my friends in Tehran were either Armenians or the White Russians, because after the revolution, then quite a bit of the Russians migrated to Tehran, and we had quite a culture of the Russians. So I had one of my friends, his name was Ray Agayan, was coming to California. He ended up by being a very well-known costume designer. He did Broadway with Lauren Bacall. He did films in Hollywood, you know, for 20th Century Fox. He's Ray Agayan. He discovered Bob Mackie, the designer, on and on and on. So he was coming here, and I was determined that I wanted to come to California. So then I worked on my mother to work on my father. And so they decided that I would, then UCLA would be because I wanted to come to UCLA because it was so close to Hollywood. So that's how then I ended up at UCLA, but as a pre-med, and not in any way having to do anything with the arts, because that was not to be spoken as far as my father was concerned. That's how I ended up then at UCLA as a pre-med. But before going to UCLA, I had to take one semester of Los Angeles High School because my English was very poor at that time. And before getting to the university, with all the chemistry and physics and all that stuff, I had to know English much better. So I then went to the LA High, which was an interesting experience because I was the only one who was dressed in a suit and a tie at LA High. And of course, very slowly, then the tie came off and the jacket went and all that stuff. So slowly, the Americanization of Lotfi Mansouri started. Well, yes, I did that because I was a very bad pre-med student. I was not interested. As a matter of fact, my foreign student advisor called me one time to his office. We had wonderful organization for foreign students at UCLA in those days, wonderful. And he said, Mr. Mansouri, that you really cannot only go to the classes you like, you also have to go to all the classes you're assigned to. Because I did not like the chemistry class, so I just didn't go. You know, I always jokingly say I never got past Bunsen burner, which was on page 13. So I said, no, I don't. So that's how, but then the interesting thing was then, because then I told my foreign student advisor, I said, but you see, my problem is because I've got physics, I've got chemistry, I've got, you know, zoology, all these things, and my English is not that good. So by the time I translate everything, it takes me hours and hours. It's very difficult because I have too much homework. I'm having major problems. And he was very kind. He says, well, why don't you then, in order to have a full load, why don't you take a class for 2 units that has no homework? And I said, is there such a class? He said, yes, why don't you go and take a choir? I said, well, I can't sing, I've never sung. She said, all right, the first semester, you take a voice class. And then the second semester, you take, get in the chorus. This way you have 2, sessions, which you have each of them 2 units, and you don't have homework. So I took a voice class. And the very first aria that, because the teacher then kind of took me over the scale, and then he kept going, and I was going la-la-laing all over the place, and all of a sudden he stopped and he said, you know, you just sang a high C. I had no idea what he was talking about, you know. And so he said, you're a tenor. And so he gave me, my first aria he gave me was che geli le manina, Rodolfo's aria. So I decided that it was time for me to start studying piano. And where I lived, fortunately, we had a very nice piano teacher. And so I started taking piano lessons. And that's how slowly then I just discovered the world of music and of the world of singing. And that's really was my beginning into that. And as you know, being a tenor, tenors were very much, sought after because there were not that many tenors. And one time I was warming up in one of the practice rooms, and a young gentleman came in and said, "You're a tenor." I said, "I think so." And he said, "Our tenor just got drafted, and we need you. Can you do this thing?" And believe it or not, that's then where I met Carol Burnett, because we were gonna. They were doing these gigs. And they were doing, it was Carol and myself and this accompanist. And we started doing these club stuff, and we each got $5, which was big time in those days. So that was another way of starting into the so-called in theater and show business. And so that was just a kind of the very slow beginning. And little by little, of course, then my concentration was really more on music and on performance than on my pre-meds. Well, the thing was, my father becoming aware of all this, because he was sending the check, of course, so I was being subsidized. And my mother came for a visit. And my mother stayed quite a long time. She loved traveling. She said she was coming here for 6 months. She stayed 3 years. And of course, this was the 3 years of my transition from pre-med. And then she said that my father said, "You really have to come home." And so she started to go home back to Iran. And on the way, she started to see a cousin of mine in Paris who was not well. She said she was going to stay for a couple of months. She stayed another year. So by the time she got to Tehran, then she told my father, "Lotfi is not going to become a doctor." And so my father, I guess he thought he was really doing the right thing. So I was getting checks every month, and it was coming through the foreign student department. And for about 4 months or so, I didn't get my checks. And then on the 5th month, then, I got a letter from my father with a one-way ticket flight back to Iran, that if I use this, I can pay all my debts and I go home, because he was very disappointed in me. And that was quite a blow for me. I mean, it was a in life you always come into a kind of a crossroad. And I remember that night very, very well. And, and so I had to really decide. I decided what did I want to do? I mean, what was, if I went back to Iran, what was going to happen to me? Because, so I decided that really was not going to be my future. So I made a decision to break. I felt I was so drawn to what I was doing that I felt that if I went, it was like committing suicide. So I then, through some friends, they arranged that I turned in my ticket. I got some money for it, paid some of my debts, and then I went independent. I started then for the first time, until I left Iran, I really didn't know how to tie my own shoelaces, because you always had servants and all that stuff. I then did every kind of work you could imagine. I worked in grocery stores, I cleaned bathrooms, I bartended, anything you could imagine for money, and that's how it was. And then slowly, then everything moved towards theater and music. So that was really the transition. I did, yeah. And then I had some wonderful, this particular time in LA was a fantastic time, because a great many gifted artists from the Central Europe and all that had run away from the Nazis and all that. We had Thomas Mann. I went to school with Schoenberg's daughter. I mean, you know, and everybody, all of them, you know, there were the Bruno Walter was there, Otto Klemper was there, you know, all that. And I was very fortunate. I ended up with a fantastic teacher. Was Fritz Zweig. Dr. Zweig had been a conductor in Berlin, a colleague of Klemperer. His wife's name was Tilly de Garmo, professional. She was a soprano with the Vienna Staatsoper. She had sang Sophie with Lotte Lehmann and all that. So through these people, then, I met incredible people. Absolutely, I had no idea who they were at that time. No idea. Now I look back and say, oh my God, I had lunch with Alma Mahler. I mean, and these people, they were all their friends. And so through Mr. Zweig then, he had me audition for Lotte Lehmann. And so I got a scholarship to go to Santa Barbara, the Music Academy of the West. And again, as a tenor, then I got to sing with everybody. As a matter of fact, Grace Bumbry and I were in the same class. And we even sang together, you know. And later on, Madame Lehmann also gave me a scholarship that even in the winters, where she had like about 20 ladies, she had sopranos and mezzos, but no men. And I was the only one. So I would go up every week for one day. And I was like a prop. If somebody was studying Carmen, I would do Don José. If somebody was studying Elsa, I would be Lohengrin and all that. But then I learned the repertoire. And I learned it with Lehmann. I believe very much in Kismet. I think where I was brought up, Kismet, destiny. I always think that the primary things in our lives is really somehow preordained, you know, and it's a Kismet. But what we do with the chances, then that's up to us. And so I was doing a performance once, a horrible piece for children, and I fell on the stage, and my arm came out of the socket and all that, and so I was in a cast and etc. So Dr. Popper, who was running the opera workshop, just to kind of keep me busy and kind of get rid of me a little bit, because I would never stop, he said, would you like to direct the prologue to Ariadne? I said, hey, why not? Because I couldn't sing, you know, perform anyway. So I took over directing the prologue to Ariadne, which is a brilliant one-act piece. And like my Zerbinetta at that time was Marnie Nixon, who then went on and became, you know, Marnie and I worked together, you know. So we had wonderful, gifted people. And so I directed, my very first thing was I directed the prologue to Ariadne with Marnie as Zerbinetta and some wonderful people in it. And I just loved it. I thought it was fantastic. And meanwhile, another gentleman who was running the City College Opera Workshop had seen my work. I had also directed some scenes. And he actually was the first one who gave me my very first professional job and my very first time that I got paid directing anything. And my very first production to direct was Così fan tutte at the City Opera with some wonderful young singers. They went to Europe, made careers. Ella Lee, there was an African-American soprano, lovely, Paige Swift. So that's how it all started. Then. So from then on, I just loved the idea of directing. Then I did everything. I directed for City College, the UCLA, Marymount College, just all over the place. Well, Dr. Graf was unbelievable. I mean, he was true. I owe my career to him. He was my artistic father. He became my mentor. And the way we got together was an interesting story because I had been in Santa Barbara with Madame Lehmann in '58, summer of '58. Grace Bumbry was there, Bennington Valente was there and all that. Then I had other plans for summer of '59. I wanted to have other experiences because by this time I had been an associate professor then at the UCLA Opera Workshop. They put me on staff. So I was now in charge of all the dramatics of the UCLA Opera Workshop. So, and I wanted to do other things theatrically, and I didn't want to go to Santa Barbara. And then the managing director of Santa Barbara before 59 called me up and said, Lotfi, Madame Lehman has a sabbatical, and she's not going to be here this summer. We have a gentleman named Herbert Graf from Metropolitan Opera. He's coming, and we want to offer you he's going to do a magic flute, so we want you to prepare the scenes for his public classes. We want you to sing monosodals and assist him on doing the production of Magic Flute. And I very reluctantly accepted, all for $500. And I said, sure, I'll do that. And at first week or so, I wasn't sure. And then all of a sudden, this man, his understanding, his depth of knowledge, his languages and all that. So we became very, very close at that time. And then, and he was very sweet, very unpretentious. You know, later on, this man, when he was 6 years old, he was analyzed by Sigmund Freud because his father was a very good friend of Sigmund Freud, and he had some, as a child, he had some name. His godfather was Gustav Mahler. I mean, this man was unbelievable. And for me to have had the luck of running into him and being accepted by him practically as a son. He had a son, but hadn't worked out very well. And so then, when we finished the summer of 59, he was flying out from LA, and I asked him, by that time, is there anything you'd like to see in LA? By that time, I had little connections in Hollywood because I had even played Caruso for a TV film. And so, would you like to go to a Hollywood studio? He said, no, I want to go to Disneyland. So I took him to Disneyland, and he took all the rides. And I even had a sign printed for him, the wanted sign, Herbert Graf, reward $5,000, like the old West. Anyway, so then he left. Then I got a call, and later on, I think it was like about October or so, I got a letter from him, from Dr. Graf from New York. Lotfi, I have just been appointed of the general director of the Zurich Opera, and I would like for you to come and join me as a stage director. I was just flabbergasted. My God, I mean, go to Zurich at the Opera House with him. Then as luck would have it, then all of a sudden I got a call. Then Mr. Bing was interested, had heard about some of my work, and he was interested. And Dr. Graf being so wonderful understanding, so I called Dr. Graf. I said, I got a call. And because Dr. Graf had been at the Met for 23 years. I called Dr. Graf, and he said, no, Lotfi, go to New York, have an interview. Then call me and tell me what your decision was. And so I then, a big time Metropolitan Opera, Mr. Rudolph Bing. So I went there for my interview. And of course, he was very, very grand, as you can imagine. It was like having the visit with the Pope. And so I went in, and then he told me, yes, Mr. Mansouri, we'd like you to be coming here as an assistant stage director. And I very diplomatically and sheepishly said, well, Mr. Bing, when would I have any possibility of doing a production of my own? And he very grandly said, oh, Mr. Mansouri, we're engaging you as assistant director. There's no talk of a production. So I went back home, and my wife and I talked, because at that time, between my wife and I think we were doing very well. I was working at 3 different universities and all these gigs and all that kind of stuff. And my wife was an assistant editor of a magazine and everything. And Dr. Graf, wanting me in Zurich, he was kind of squeezing me in. So there wasn't that much money. And the Met contract was actually financially much, much better. Like 10 times better than what I was going to get. But my wife and I discussed it. I said, no. So I said, we're going to Zurich. And I called Dr. Graf, and I said, no, I'm going to come. And it was the greatest decision I ever made. So that was it. That's how I ended up at Zurich as a resident stage director. Well, I tell you why, because Dr. Graf was so generous to me. My first season, I got to do 3 new productions, big stuff, Samson, Delilah, Traviata, new productions, everything. Then what he did was amazing. As this young nobody, he paired me with Otto Klemperer. I directed Fidelio with Klemperer conducting. He paired me with Gavazzeni, who was the music director of La Scala. I mean, he gave me opportunities. An incredible artist, one of James McCracken, I mean, Release de la Carte, some of the greatest, this nobody, I mean, from Tehran, Iran. And so I really then, I did everything. I did from soup to nuts. I did big stuff. I did Meyerbeer, Le Prophète with James McCracken. Then I did Carnival. I did the American premiere of the American musical Carnival. David Merrick came for the opening night and all that kind of stuff. So I did everything. I did Wozzeck, I did Lulu, I did Samson, Delilah, Traviata. I got a chance to do everything. And then later on, he got into trouble. The board, I mean, I think they were a little bit scared. There was changes and all that. So he quit Zurich, and he left. And I continued on. The new director kept me. And then about 2-3 years later, then Dr. Graf called me, Lotfi, I just signed to be the general director of Geneva Grand Théâtre. Would you like to come and join me? Would I? So that's how I went to Geneva. And then in Geneva, then I became the director of productions. So that I was like, what they called in French, chef metteur en scène. So that would be like, of that. So that there again, I ended up by doing some marvelous stuff. He gave me, again, incredible artists. Well, Gwyneth Jones did her very first Tosca. She did her very first Desdemona, with yours truly directing and all that kind of stuff. So I developed a vast repertoire. And also Dr. Graf was very generous in the sense I started in guesting. I started in San Francisco. Mr. Adler came and saw the Prophète in Geneva, in Zurich. And then the first couple of years in San Francisco, each season Mr. Adler gave me 6 productions, 6 operas from soups to nuts. My very first time with Joan Sutherland was here. We did Sonnambula, and I fell in love with her, and I'm still in love with her. And marvelous. I did Tabaldi, Corelli, all that kind of stuff. So it was that, and then I continued on in Geneva then. And then unfortunately, Dr. Graf then had cancer, and he died. And then the gentleman who came after Dr. Graf didn't like me, of course, because I was so associated with the pastors. What always happens when a new general director comes. And I just, in a way, it was one of the best things that happened to me, because I was so comfortable in Geneva, I could still be in Geneva. Well, yes, because in 1971, the Shah, who was the son of the first Shah, Pahlavi, he was very much in the process of modernizing Iran. And in 1971, he kind of fabricated a 2,500-year anniversary of Iran as a society, and Persia and all that stuff. And he gave an incredible party in Persepolis when they made these fantastic tents where it was all catered by Maximes of Paris. And it was unbelievable, Prince Philip. And they built an opera house, a beautiful opera house built by the same architect that built the opera house in Berlin, the Deutsche Oper. A visitor showed up in Geneva that Mr. Mansouri, there's this big, and saying, we would like you to come to Iran. At that time, I was very nervous, and because I had not had any relationship with my father and all that, and then the whole thing really shook me. Did I want to go back, and et cetera. I decided no, I didn't want to go back. And so I made an excuse, and I said, well, no, I'm on the contract in Geneva, and Dr. Graf got me assignments, etc. But of course, these guys were very smart, so they went and talked to Dr. Graf. And Dr. Graf, thinking that I wanted to go, said, "Oh, of course you can go." So anyway, so I then went back. I went back and I did, and they treated me really royally. They treated me, it was a wonderful house. They had 5 different orchestras. They had the symphonic orchestra, the opera orchestra, the ballet orchestra, the ethnic orchestra, the chamber ensemble. And the Shah was desperately trying to modernize Iran, very, very strongly. But unfortunately, he was kind of force-feeding this process rather than educating. And because opera, nobody knew, so but my very first production that I did for them was Carmen. Of course, every opera I directed there was the very first time in Iran. They had never done it. And money was no object. And Iran in the early 70s was like the time Alaska must have been in gold rush. I mean, every company was there wanting to get contracts and building this and building that. It was absolutely incredible. I mean, as a matter of fact, for us to bring famous singers from Europe, we had to rent hotel rooms for the year because the hotels like Intercontinental, Sheraton, Hilton, they were all so booked that sometimes people would sleep in the lobbies. It was a gold rush. It was an atmosphere. It was incredible. And they treated me absolutely incredibly, I mean, I must say, But it was also very dangerous because I went there on my American passport. And at the airport, they took my American passport away and they said, "You're Iranian." And that's a very long story. Anyway, finally, I had to get my Iranian passport first before I could get my American passport. The whole thing was rather traumatic.
But you did become the artistic advisor.
Yeah,
to the
then,
culture, yes?
yeah, but what it was, then they wanted me to become the director and move to Tehran. And at that time, my daughter was about 6 years old, and my wife, and thinking of leaving from Geneva, Switzerland, going to Tehran, all that, I said, no. So I did an incredible amount of, shall we say, tab routines, trying to see how I could diplomat, because my father was still there, and I did make up with my father, and he was a wonderful, wonderful man, and we had a fabulous reunion. I saw my grandmother, the whole family. But the thing was that, so I kept saying, so finally I talked to the Ministry of Culture, who, by the way, happened to have been the brother-in-law of the Shah, who was married, to his sister. I convinced him that I really could serve them more if I continued in Europe, and I would be an advisor. So then I became an advisor. And then every year I would go there and do productions. And they had, like, the stage had turntables and elevators. It was just incredible. Everything about the chorus, the entire chorus, they were Armenians. Because Iranians, they had no history of really Western music and all that. The orchestra, they were all East European people. They were all who had retired from Poland and Yugoslavia and all that, and would come there, and they were earning very good. Money was no object. When I did Aida there, I got 2 regiments of the military for the triumphal scene. I had fantastic Tito Gobbi, Beverly Hills. I did falsetto with Giuseppe Taddei. I mean, some of the greatest talents. Money was no object. Well, the public were mostly Europeans. I mean, they were all the French, the Germans, the British. There were some of them. And then, of course, then they also started an incredible festival at Persepolis. Persepolis, there's ruins in south of Iran in the summer. And all of a sudden, they had this incredible modern music, like Stockhausen. And I would say, very diplomatically, wouldn't you like to start with maybe with Mozart or Beethoven? And the gentleman in charge says, Lotfi, they wouldn't know the difference. So, okay. So it was a wild time. It was crazy, and I was a nervous wreck. Every time I would go home in Geneva, it was like coming from the pressure. I would take about 4 to 6 weeks to kind of collect myself again, and then at the same time I would go there, and of course I had from one side the family, and then of course then I was caught because from one side I was with the ruling class, from the other side, because I had been in Europe and America, a lot of the people who were not happy, they would seek me out, and they would want it, and I was just caught between these two poles, which made it very difficult for me. Because from one side, I would be having lunch at the Minister of Finance house, and from the other, I would be offered a car and a driver and all that kind of stuff. And then from the other side, there were these people, some of the Armenians, who were really mistreated, and there were Christians and etc. And then they would take me to a clandestine lunch. Lotfi, can you help me? So and so and so and so. So I wanted to get out of there because it was very complicated emotionally and politically for me. It was a very complicated situation. Well, no, I think the transition for me, everything was really, I was very fortunate. All of my transitions were gradual. They were really, it was not anything sudden, because from a singer, for example, going to a director, then from a director, then going much more of a professional and becoming more of an international, because I did a lot of work in Italy, I did a lot of work in Germany, in different houses and etc. And then when Dr. Graf then was very sick with cancer, then in Geneva, then I would end up as a director of production, then would take over some of the responsibilities, and etc. And then when the gentleman who was nominated after Dr. Graf, his name was Jean-Claude Ribert, when he came, of course, he couldn't stand me. And all of a sudden, all of my major productions were taken away. And I was getting all the leftover, operettas and all that kind of stuff. And here I was directing a La Scala with Luciano Pavarotti, and then I would go back and he would give me a leftover Land of Smiles of that. So it became very uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. From one side, my family life was very comfortable. We had a beautiful house in the country. I could see the Alps, the lake. My daughter was going to the village school. She was speaking perfect French. So that part was idyllic. Professionally, it was a nightmare. And so I said, it's time to move. It's really time to really. And then it happened that the gentleman who was retiring in Toronto as the general director of Canadian Opera Company had seen me at different functions and had seen some of my work. So he then called me one time, very, very confidentially, that he was going to retire. Would I be interested if my name would be put up as a possible replacement? At that time, I didn't even know what Toronto was. I mean, I knew Vancouver because I had worked in Vancouver. And at that time, hey, any ball in the air, I'll take it. So I said, sure, put my name up. And they put my name. They had apparently 129 names. Then finally, they went to 9 serious. And then I went through the whole process of interviewing, and I could always tell how it was moving. Because the first time I flew to Toronto, my hotel room was $18, I think, at night. The last time I was there, it was $260. So I knew they were getting a little serious about me. So then finally the choice was between 2 people. And then they decided on me. And that's how then I moved there. It was a perfect move. Well, I was very fortunate in Toronto. Again, it's kismet, because Canada was going through a whole growing up process. Because until then, Montreal had been the city in Canada because of the French and the culture and all that stuff. Then all of a sudden, Montreal had started this kind of the separatist movement and all that stuff. And of course, the banks and all, they started getting a little nervous about this. And so Toronto, which had been a rather provincial, very Anglo-Saxon town when I went there, all of a sudden started to explode. It just grew. And I was very lucky because then the Canadian Opera Company then grew with the city. When I got there, we were doing 4 productions a year. We ended up by doing 8, 9 productions. When I started there, it was only in the fall till October. By the time I left there, we were all year. I did Lady Macbeth and Mensensk. I did the first Meistersinger in Canada. I did Death in Venice, Peter Grant. Everything was like the first time that there. I did a lot. And then, of course, I was very fortunate. By this time, I had made very good connections in the profession. So I had Dame Joan Sutherland coming there to do Norma. And then I could then put that on. If you wanted Dame Joan, you had to buy the subscription. And so we did a lot of this marketing kind of stuff. And Joan was wonderful, very generous. And I talked her into doing her first Anna Bolena. So we did a whole new production of Anna Bolena. We started having telecast. Then I had the great pleasure of talking her doing her one and only Ophelia in Hamlet. She had recorded it, but we did Hamlet of Thomas. And she did Ophelia. So having Joan Sutherland, having some major star, I had Tatiana Troyanos doing. I adore that woman, wonderful artist. So by bringing then major artists and all that, and the audience grew. Well, my master plan is always tomorrow. It's always tomorrow, and to always do better. I don't sit down. I'm not an architect. I don't draw the designs. I have emotions and I have feelings. And I want to go with that. I felt that city was ready for a full-year opera company. And I was very lucky. I ended up by having wonderful partners. We expanded our spring season because there was a wonderful theater called Royal Alexandra. And we put an incredible, like what I did there, actually what I did in San Francisco, we did a season of only 2 operas. We did Carmen and Cenerentola, 16 performances each with 3 different casts, 8 performances a week. And that was the model I used when I did the Bohème here in San Francisco, where we did 4 weeks of Bohème, 8 performances a week, 3 different casts, but always with great artists. Like the Bohèmes with Patricia Racette as Mimi, with Marcello Giordani as Rodolfo, not, John Riley as Colina and all that. And so that's how I did it there. But it's not, I don't sit down and theorize. Theory, I find it dry. I find acting, doing is much more, you get more done. But talking and just, taking hypothesis and doing, that's not me. This never has been. Well, yes, when I started them, I called them surtitles because of the subtitles. But then when the story is really this, and I owe a little bit of that to my wife, because, and also as a stage director, because here I was working like hell to motivate every nuance of every line, the character relation, and the audience didn't know what the hell they were talking about, and so that it was not a matter, and then that's why opera in the past had been, the old saying, they said park and bark, and just stand there, and just stand there and sing, and most of the time it was a kind of a concert in costumes. Because whereas actually, when you look at opera, how it started the way we know it, in Florence, it was called opera per musica, work with music theater. So I always felt that opera was the idea. It's the greatest art form created by the human mind. It's the totality of it. It's the music, theater, everything. So we were watching The Ring on television, my wife and I, the Patrice Choreau, wonderful production. And my wife is not a Wagnerian. She's never really cared about Wagner that much. And so she said, and because on television there's the titles, she said, in the middle of Valkyrie, she said, Lotfi, this is not as dumb as I thought it was. All of a sudden the lamp dying, I said, if they do on television, and I love foreign films, so I go to love French films and Italian films. If they do it in the cinema, why cannot we not do it in the theater? As a stage director, I want the audience to get all the psychological and emotional nuances. So, and the reason I wanted to do it very much, actually my goal was, one of my very favorite operas is Coronation of Poppaea, which is very Shakespearean. It's a wonderful piece with a lot of characters and all that. But the text is so vital, so vital. And I wanted the audience to know the drama, what was going on, And so, before that, I decided to test this process with a production of Elektra that I was directing. That's how it all started. And then, of course, I got blasted. Critics, there was an editorial or something in the opera magazine from England. They call it the plague from Canada. I had vulgarized opera. I had done this and all that. Everybody, all the critics, then all of a sudden came on my back that I had really, but I didn't give a damn because all of a sudden your audience was involved. It wasn't just listening to pretty tunes. It was understanding that these great composers, Strauss, Puccini, Verdi, they all loved great, great dramas. Verdi used Shakespeare, Schiller, Puccini used Belasco, Strauss, Hofmannsthal. They are wonderful, wonderful texts. And so the audience should really know what is going on, in not just in generic line, but that all the psychological depths that is in a piece like Poppaea or is in an Elektra or Rosenkavalier, or on and on and on. So that's really how it all started. I think that was very funny because a lot of the critics at first did not like the titles. And I always said a kind of a little naughty. I thought that the reason was because all of a sudden everybody was going to know what they knew. So their task was getting a little more complicated. So they were at first being very, very kind of, oh, mon Dieu, to do this, to vulgarize opera like this. Excuse me. The audience is beginning to understand the details, the relationships, the psychological nuances, the motivations and all that. And I think that down the line, in a way, when the audiences accept, because Beverly Sills went on the television, actually once when she was interviewing me, she said that 20 to 30% there was increase in our audience since the titles, because people were not afraid of opera anymore. All of a sudden, they didn't think it was stupid. It wasn't the baby, which baby got burned in Trovatore, all that stuff. That these were wonderful stories. They were psychologically motivated, the relationships, the fabulously three-dimensional characters. And then when the audience then started accepting it, I think the critics had to accept it in a way. But at the beginning of it, then all of a sudden, oh mon Dieu, one of their tools was taken away from them. So I think that I felt that they were, and also one of the things that I must say, that some of the things about the critics is also right, because now the titles have become such a fixture. Now the quality of the titles must be very, very important. You do not translate Barbara Seville the same way you do Wozzeck. That every opera must have its own stylistic translation. And the timing is now technically must be much, much better to not anticipate the jokes, the punchlines and all that. So I think the titles now have to be more refined. They must have a very, very strong intellectual, absolutely, quality, literary quality. And it must complement the piece that it's serving. And you can't just translate words. And also the stage directors must take a role in that themselves to be very careful that the nuance of the translation, it is the dramatic nuance they want emotionally, except not do what Peter Sellers did. Peter Sellers actually used the titles by having the characters say what he wanted them to say, not what the text said. That's a little exaggerated. But it's the nuance, because words are so rich. So I think the stage directors must really take part in working the titles, in the atmosphere and the mood and the dramatic context of the piece they're directing. They were not. They were not. The wonderful part of it was, though, I wanted to do it for new audiences. Not the opera fans came anyway because we had fabulous cast. But I wanted to tell people that take a chance, take a risk. And I loved it because we got, of the Bohème, we sold 45,000 tickets for these 4 weeks, which is incredible. And what was wonderful, one of the story I've used many, many times, and then I would always stay at after the end of the performance, I wanted to see the reaction of these new people. And one of the happiest reactions I had, a very, very nice looking, a handsome couple in their kind of Armani chic and all that. They came and said, "Oh, Mr. Mansouri, was this the original Broadway cast?" So, and then later on, of course, Baz Luhrmann did his Broadway Bohème, but we did, and then after that, I also did Butterfly. We ran it also, with wonderful people, Kathy Malfitano, and, all that. So I felt that opera should be accessible. And then later on, then we went back into the house, because we had, my very first year as general director, we had a major earthquake. It was a wonderful beginning. And so when the house was renovated and we went back to the house, I extended our season. And I added 4 weeks in January. And a lot of the new people came. And we sold out. I repeated. I did, like, for example, I had done Marriage of Figaro in the fall with Brain Turfall and others. So in January, I put it in with Anna Netrebko as Susanna and John Relly as Figaro. I got a couple of letters that, "Why don't you give us the stars?" I said, "Now they got to go to the Met to hear these guys." But then they sold out. But I did all the popular stuff. I did the Figaro, I did Tosca, and all that. And so we expanded the season. And then, of course, my goal in San Francisco was to have a spread season, because usually it was only in the fall, and sometimes some festivals in the June. So the very last time that I accomplished it, really, was just about the year before I retired. And now that you start in September and you go till the end of June. So that was that. What we did, because I find the repertoire of operatic repertoire is so rich. That's why I say it's an incredible banquet. I mean, you have caviar on one side and you got pasta asciutta on the other side, and in between, anything you want. And another repertoire which I loved, which we had not done that much here, was really the Russian repertoire. So I was very fortunate that I ran into Valery Gergiev. I brought him, that was his first American debut actually, with San Francisco Opera. And he, of course, loved the Russian repertoire, and he realized how much I loved it. And so with his collaboration, we did some wonderful, first of all, we did War and Peace, which was incredible. We have a fabulous cast for that. Then we did Ruslan Lyudmila of Glenka, who was the father of the Russian opera. And that's how Anna Netrebko came here. I brought her here when she was 23 years old. And then we did Tsar's Bride. And of course, one advantage the general director has, I can give myself the best casts. So I did the Tsar's Bride of Rimsky-Korsakov. Anna Netrebko, Olga Borodina, and Dmitry Khorostovsky. Not bad. And of course, so we added we did the Fiery Angel, we did the Betrothal in the Monastery. Then on the other side, I also love the French repertoire. So then I added Herodiade for René Fleming and Placido Domingo. There was some Verdi that had never been done. I did Attila, that had never been done here. We did Vespri Siciliani, which had never been done here. So besides, of course, modern things, I'm a big fan of Werner Henze. We did Das Fraten Meer. From him, I Love Britain. I did Death in Venice. So we mixed and matched. We did the Bohèmes and Butterflies and Barbers and all that. But then I tried to also expand the repertoire between the kind of the repertoire that we had never done, like the Russian repertoire, which had never been done, and then the other repertoire, unknown Verdi. I did Daphne of Strauss for the first time. I really added to it. Rossini, we had never done William Tell. So we did the William Tell, which is a brilliant piece. I don't understand why the Met doesn't do it. It's a brilliant piece. We did William Tell. We did Ermione of Rossini. Even what we did the Lucio Silla of Mozart had never been done. So I try to, the well-known composers, the less known and unknown, just kind of do a mix to say that, because there's this incredible gamut. And it's wonderful. There's such richness. And I wanted to everybody says, look, it's not just Butterfly and Bohème all the time or Carmen. Look at this. This is all wonderful. Well, when I started my work at San Francisco Opera as a general director, my dream was I would commission one new work a year, because I felt the San Francisco Opera, with the tradition and with the wonderful qualities, with Merola, who started it, Mr. Adler, who was fantastic, and Terry McKeown, it was an excellent tradition here, excellent. And many operas were done in the United States, first in San Francisco, Frauen und Schatten, a lot of major operas. And so I felt that I wanted to start one, but of course that was really like a pipe dream, because commissioning, it's so complicated and it's so time-consuming. And so I started, the Pacific Vision was really with that feeling that I wanted one opera, a new opera a year. So we ended up, one of the first ones then was the Death of Klinghoffer, which was originally Jean Mortier was going to do it when he was at Théâtre Monet in Brussels. And we felt that, and I love John Adams, and I love his music, and I thought, my God, and that story and everything like that. So I said, sure, I'd like to partner with that. And that's how that started. Then, of course, I wanted many other you should see the list I had of. And also what I wanted to establish was, because I felt that opera in America had suffered a little bit by being very Eurocentric. Everybody thought it was very much of a European art form and all that, was elitist and all that. I thought it was nonsense. I felt that, America should have its own voice and its own literature and all that. You have such fabulous plays in the United States, that wonderful playwrights, Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams, all that people. So I had a whole stack of plays that I felt it would be wonderful if I could find the right composer for each one of these. So The Streetcar had been one, of course, for years. The very first composer I ever approached for that was when I was in G. I approached Leonard Bernstein. I was working in Vienna, and I thought he'd be ideal for, with his, lyricism and the jazz and all that stuff. So that's how it all started, that I've had these plays that I felt that they would make. And then, of course, we did the Klinghoffer. I wanted very much, Streetcar was one of my dreams. I felt that Blanche Dubois could rival Lucia, could rival Violetta, if you got the right composer. And that's how I have got another list. If Peter Gelb is ready or anybody, I'll give him my plays. Taking all Americans, a wonderful American thing. The Dangerous Liaison, I saw the play, and I was just ball over. And I thought, oh my God, this is fabulous. I thought, it reminded me a little bit, I said, it's a dark side of Così fan tutte. It's all about human relationships and all that. And I said, oh, Mozart, where are you when I need you? So that's how the Dangerous Liaison started, that I felt that those characters, Valmont, and and what was great about that, and I always felt that the old days they used to do operas was they would write it for artists. Verdi would write it for a special soprano. So I had the luxury, I gave myself the luxury of having the cast first. So when I thought of the Dangerous Liaison, I thought of Renée Fleming and Madame Tourville. I thought Michelle Pfeiffer, Renée Fleming, perfect pairing. And von Stade, whom I adore, as the elegant Madame la Marquise. And I thought Tom Hampson would be ideal as Valmont. It's a kind of a Don Giovanni, that type of thing. So I did, and I loved them because they trusted me. They accepted it without having seen the music. And they were wonderful in it. They were absolutely, I mean, all three of them. They were, and then, of course, the rest of the cast was fantastic. They had Judith Forrest, they had Johanna Meyer, Mary Mills, and on and on and on. So it was, every one of them was a kind of a dream for me, that I wanted to pick a special play. So I wanted, the next one I wanted to do, I was dying to do Death of a Salesman. So if anybody wants to start it, that's an American King Lear. I mean, that could be with a right composer. And so that's how it all started. Well, I find the greatest development I felt in art, because what I think is wonderful, in the artistic endeavor, art must always be developing. Art should never stop developing. Opera developed before my time, and opera is going to develop after my time. And I've loved the evolution of opera in America, because I think what has happened, which I think it's a wonderful sign for the art form, Americans are finally finding their own voice in opera. They're finally realizing it's not Eurocentric anymore. It's all of us, and some of the best artists in the world of opera today are Americans. They're trained by these fabulous young artist programs, the opera companies, Chicago, San Francisco, Santa Fe, on and on and on and on. So there's been a great improvement in opera as music theater. And I think that's for me. And the greatest thing for me has been that Americans now are accepting opera as also as a form of their own expression. Look at all the new American operas that are being written. The Somerset Maugham Letter being premiered in Santa Fe this summer with Pat Rosset, and all of that. I think all of us that doesn't have to have that made in Europe stamp anymore. And the audiences now have become aware of opera as a total music theater. They love beautiful singing right now, but just singing is not enough now. I mean, the days of, as I said, Park and Bark, oh God, there's still a little bit of that left over. But they want music theater. They want music theater. They want the Flemings. They want the Natalie Dessay. And they want these, these wonderful artists who not only sing beautifully and musically, they have fabulous developed voices, but they make those notes mean something. It's at a service of an emotion. It's a service of drama, of character, of relationships. And this is development that I find very gratifying as an old person in the opera in the United States. And I see the future of opera very, very positive and optimistic. Because I think now, look at all the technical developments that's happening. My dream was talk George Lucas to come and do a Ring and Nibelungen or something like that. Without the computer-generated graphics, all that stuff. I find the future of opera very, very exciting in the United States. So that's my feeling about the future of the opera and what I've seen in my lifetime here. Oh, Marilyn Horne, and I go back over 50 years from LA. We had the same teacher. She's an incredible lady. She hasn't changed that much. She's exactly the way she used to be 50 years ago. And when I remember her very well, as I said, we would always go for the auditions, and she always would win, and I would always fail. And and I've loved her, and I've worked with her. I've directed her. Of course, I directed Norman with Joan Southern and all that. And we've been very good colleagues. And she does a fantastic foundation where she sees the future of the song recitals and all that. And she's a superb coach, My God, she's an incredible, and she understands the vocal technique just about better than just about anybody, I think. No, we go back quite a few years. Well, I have been a great fan of John Adams, and I've not only just as the death of Klinghoffer, of course they also did his Dr. Atomic. I even one time, I even offered him another composition, which at that time I don't think he had the time or anything to do. I think he should do many more operas. I really think he should, because he's got the talent, he's got the facility, and he writes beautifully for the voice. I just feel, John, do more operas. Julius is a remarkable man, because Julius, can you imagine what this man has done in his lifetime? Look at what he did at the City Opera. All the new works he presented, all the new works. The Strauss, so it's all unbelievable. A lot of people forget what Julius has done because he just does it. You know, the last time I worked with Julius actually was a few years ago. We were both doing a rather complicated production of Merry Widow in Teatro Colón, Buenos Aires. And shall we say that the organization was not very organized? But he coped beautifully. We had Federico von Stade, of course, as the widow, and Tom Allen, and he's the best way I can describe Julius. He describes what is a pro. He's a professional to the nth degree in everything: music, theater, anything. Well, Frank is a colleague, of course, because I engaged him to do productions for me in Toronto. And he really was one of the first ones who really thought of opera as music theater. I mean, you look at the productions he did at the City Opera, you know, and the Village Romeo and Juliet and all that, very, very innovative with the projections and all that. So he really is one of the innovators in the field of opera as a stage director, that he really, from the beginning, he said, opera is music theater. And he had the musical knowledge and the theatrical knowledge that he just kind of brought all together as one package.